pushed you away. They built walls. They tested your patience, your worth, your limits, and still you stayed. Not out of weakness, but because your love came from a place they couldn't even understand. And now, deep down, the avoidant can't believe one thing, that you still love them through all of it. There is a kind of love in this world that doesn't scream, doesn't chase, doesn't beg. It stands. It stands firm in truth. It stands grounded in purpose. And when that kind of love meets, someone who has spent their entire life running from emotions, from vulnerability, from themselves, it creates a storm inside them they cannot control. You see, the avoidant isn't heartless. That's the illusion. That's the mask. The truth is they feel deeply, but they've trained themselves not to stay in that feeling. Because feeling means exposure. Feeling means risk. Feeling means they might lose control. And control is the only thing they think keeps them safe. And then you came along. You play games. You didn't manipulate. You didn't withdraw your love just to get a reaction. You showed up again and again. Not perfectly, but authentically. And that authenticity, it shook them. Because now, for the first time, they were face to face with something real, something they couldn't dismiss, something they couldn't outrun as easily. And that's where the conflict begins. Part of them wanted to run because that's what they've always done. But another part, a quieter, deeper part, started to recognize something. Safety, warmth, truth. And that part, it scared them even more. Because now, it wasn't just about avoiding you, it was about avoiding what you awakened inside them. Understand this. When someone pulls away from love, it's rarely about the love itself. It's about what that love demands of them. Growth, honesty, vulnerability. And if they are not ready to meet those demands, they will retreat even from the very thing they need the most. But here's where your power lies. You didn't abandon yourself in loving them. You didn't lose your identity trying to fix them. You simply were. And in being, you created something profound as standard. A frequency, a level of love that they had never experienced before. And now, whether you're still there or you've walked away, that experience stays with them. Because real love doesn't disappear. It imprints. It becomes the reference point they measure everything else against. And that's why deep down, they can't believe. You still love them through all of it. Through the silence, through the distance, through the confusion. Because in their world, love is conditional, temporary, fragile. But you showed them something different. You showed them that love can be strong without being controlling, present without being suffocating, patient without losing its power. And that realization, it changes people. Not always immediately, not always in ways you can see. But seeds were planted, seeds of awareness, seeds of truth. And those seeds, they grow. So don't question your worth. Don't rewrite your story as if you were too much or not enough. You were exactly what you were meant to be. A catalyst, a mirror, a force of love that disrupted their patterns and challenged their reality. And whether they rise to meet that love or continue to run from it is no longer your responsibility, because your purpose was never to save them. Your purpose was to show them what's possible. And you did. Real love has a way of illuminating the parts of a person they've spent years trying to keep in the dark. It doesn't attack, it doesn't force, it doesn't demand, but it reveals. And for someone who has built their identity around avoidance, around distance, around emotional self-protection, that kind of revelation can feel overwhelming. Because what you offered wasn't just affection or attention, it was clarity. And clarity is uncomfortable when someone has been surviving through denial. When you showed up with consistency, with presence, with a kind of care that didn't fluctuate based on mood or control, you unknowingly became a mirror. Not a mirror that reflects what they want to see, but one that shows what actually is. And in that reflection, they began to see their patterns, how they pull away when things get real, how they shut down when emotions rise, how they create space, not because they don't care, but because they don't know how to stay. And here's the truth most people miss. People don't resist love because they don't want it. They resist it because it exposes the gap between who they are and who they know they could be. That gap creates tension. And tension, if someone isn't ready to grow, feels like pressure. So when you love them fully without manipulation, without games, you remove their usual escape routes. They couldn't blame inconsistency. They couldn't point to chaos. They couldn't justify their distance by saying, this isn't real, because it was real. And that reality forced them into a confrontation with themselves. Suddenly, the narrative they had been telling themselves started to crack. I don't need anyone. I'm better on my own. Emotions complicate everything. These beliefs, which once felt like protection, started to feel like limitations. And that's a deeply unsettling place to be, because now they're faced with a choice. Evolve or retreat. Many choose retreat, not because it's what they truly want, but because it's what they know. Familiar. Pain feels safer than unfamiliar growth. So they pull away. They create distance. They go silent. Not as a punishment to you, but as a way to regain control over the internal chaos your love stirred up. But what they don't realize in that moment is that once something is seen, it cannot be unseen. Once real love has touched a person, it leaves a mark. It rewires their awareness. And even if they try to go back to who they were before you, something inside them knows it's no longer the same. That's the power of what you brought into their life. You didn't just love them, you revealed them. You brought their fears to the surface, but you also showed them what exists beyond those fears. And that's why your presence felt so intense to them. Not because you were too much, but because you were too real for where they were in their journey. And here's where your strength comes into play. It takes courage to love someone who cannot fully receive it. It takes awareness to recognize that. Their resistance is not a reflection of your worth, but a reflection of their readiness. And it takes power to not shrink yourself just to make someone else comfortable in their limitations. You became a turning point in their life, whether they acknowledge it now or not. Because love like yours doesn't just pass through, it transforms. It challenges, it awakens. And even if they walked away from it, they carry that awakening with them. Avoidants don't fear love in the way most people think they. Fear what love requires of them. On the surface, they may appear distant, independent, even emotionally unavailable. But beneath that exterior is a carefully constructed identity built on self-reliance and control. That identity didn't form by accident. It was shaped by experiences that taught them. Consciously or unconsciously, that closeness leads to discomfort, vulnerability leads to pain, and dependence leads to loss of control. So they adapted. They learned to rely on themselves, to minimize emotional needs, to create space before anyone else could take it away from them. And then intimacy shows up. Not surface level connection, not casual interaction, but real, deep, consistent intimacy. The kind that sees beyond the mask. The kind that doesn't disappear when things get uncomfortable. And suddenly everything they've built their identity around starts to feel threatened. Because intimacy requires presence. It requires openness. It requires letting someone see you not just at your best, but at your most uncertain, your most unguarded. And for someone who has spent years avoiding that exposure, it doesn't feel safe, it feels destabilizing. So the fear isn't about you. It's about what being close to you demands from them. It challenges the belief that they are better off alone. It questions the idea that emotions are something to suppress rather than express. It pushes against the narrative that vulnerability equals weakness. And when those core beliefs are challenged, the mind reacts. It looks for ways to restore balance, to return to what feels familiar. That's why you may have seen moments of closeness followed by sudden distance. Moments where they leaned in, only to pull away just as things started to feel real. That push and pull isn't random. It's a reflection of an internal battle. One part of them is drawn to the connection. You can feel it in the way they show up sometimes, in the way they let their guard down, even briefly. But another, part of them is activated by fear, reminding them of all the reasons they've kept people at a distance in the past. And when fear and desire collide, fear often wins at least in the short term. So they create space. They become less available. They convince themselves they need independence, that things are moving too fast, that something doesn't feel right. But what they're really responding to isn't a flaw in the connection, it's the discomfort of stepping outside their emotional comfort zone. Because intimacy, real intimacy, requires a shift in identity. It asks them to become someone who can stay present in moments they would normally escape. It asks them to trust where they've always been guarded. It asks them to feel where they've always avoided. And that kind of transformation doesn't happen easily. It requires awareness. It requires willingness. And most importantly, it requires them to confront parts of themselves they've spent years avoiding. That's why your presence felt so significant. You weren't just another person in their life, you represented a different way of being, a way that didn't rely on distance to feel safe, a way that embraced connection without losing strength. And even if they couldn't fully step into that with you, they recognized it on some level. They felt the difference. And that feeling created tension because it showed them that another version of themselves was possible, a version that could love openly, connect deeply, and still feel secure. But stepping into that version requires letting go of the old identity, the one built on avoidance, and letting go of something that has protected you for so long, even if it no longer serves you, can feel like losing a part of yourself. So instead of transforming, they retreat. Not because they don't care, but because they don't yet know how to be the person that kind of love calls them to become. Consistency is one of the most powerful forces in human connection. And for someone who is emotionally avoidant, it doesn't just feel unfamiliar, it feels disorienting. They are used to unpredictability, to emotional distance, to relationships where space is the norm and closeness is temporary. So when you show up in a way that is steady, grounded, and reliable, it creates something inside them they are not prepared for. It introduces a new pattern, and that new pattern begins to challenge everything they thought they understood about relationships. At first, it may feel comforting too. There's a sense of ease in knowing you're not going anywhere at the first sign of difficulty. There's a quiet relief in experiencing someone who doesn't react impulsively, who doesn't create chaos, who doesn't play games. But as that consistency continues, something deeper begins to happen. It starts to dismantle their expectations. They may have believed that all relationships eventually become overwhelming, that closeness leads to loss of freedom, or that emotional investment always. It comes with a cost. But your steady presence contradicts those beliefs. You don't demand control. You don't punish them for needing space. You don't turn love into a transaction. And because of that, their internal system doesn't quite know how to process you. This is where the conflict begins. Part of them starts to relax into the connection. They begin to trust, even if only in small moments. They start to feel something they haven't allowed themselves to feel in a long time: safety. But at the same time, another part of them becomes alert. Because safety and connection is unfamiliar, and unfamiliar territory can feel dangerous to someone who has built their identity around emotional self-protection. So now they are caught between two opposing forces. One part is drawn toward the consistency you bring, toward the calm, toward the stability. The other part is scanning for a reason to pull away, to create distance, to regain control. And this internal tug of war can become exhausting. They may start to question their own feelings. Why do I feel this way? Why am I getting so close? What if this changes? The more consistent you are, the more those questions intensify, because your presence is not giving them any clear justification to retreat, yet the urge to retreat still exists. That's what makes it so confusing for them. If you were inconsistent, if you were unpredictable, it would be easier. They could point to a reason, tell themselves a story that justifies their distance. But when you remain steady, when your actions align with your words, when your energy doesn't fluctuate based on fear or control, it removes their usual escape routes. And without those escape routes, they are left alone with their own discomfort. That discomfort doesn't mean something is wrong with the connection. It means something is being activated within them. Old patterns, old fears, old conditioning all rising to the surface because they are being challenged by something new. Here's the paradox. The very thing they need consistency is also the thing that creates their internal resistance. Because consistency builds trust, but it also requires them to let their guard down. It invites them into a deeper level of connection, one where they can no longer hide behind distance or detachment. And if they are not ready to meet that level of openness, they may begin to pull back, even while a part of them wants to move forward. That's why you may have seen moments where felt aligned, where they seem present, engaged, even emotionally available, only for that to be followed by withdrawal. It's not a reflection of your value or the authenticity of the connection. It's a reflection of the internal conflict your consistency is creating within them. You became something real in a space where they are used to keeping things controlled and contained, and real connection doesn't stay neatly within those boundaries. It expands, it deepens, it asks more. If they are not yet equipped to handle that expansion, they will instinctively try to reduce it by creating space, by pulling back, by returning to what feels familiar. But even in that distance, the impact of your consistency remains. Because once someone experiences a form of love that is steady and genuine, it reshapes their understanding, whether they are ready to fully embrace it or not. Your presence did something most people never realize they're capable of. It held up a mirror. It couldn't be ignored. Not the kind of mirror that reflects surface-level traits or curated versions of self, but one that reveals patterns, defenses, and truths that usually stay hidden beneath distraction and distance. And for someone who has mastered the art of avoidance, that kind of reflection is deeply unsettling. Because when a person spends years disconnecting from their own emotions, they also disconnect from self-awareness. They move through life on autopilot, keeping things light, keeping things controlled, keeping things just far enough away to avoid discomfort. It becomes normal. It becomes their version of safety. But the moment they encounter someone who is grounded, emotionally present, and authentic, that autopilot begins to fail. That's what your presence did. You didn't chase them. You didn't try to force them into vulnerability. You simply were. And in being, you created contrast. A contrast between emotional presence and emotional avoidance, between truth and deflection, between connection and control. And contrast creates awareness. They began to notice things about themselves that they could previously ignore. How they shut down when conversations got deeper. How they changed the subject when emotions surfaced. How they created space, not because they didn't care, but because they didn't know how to stay. These weren't things you had to point out. Your consistency, your calm, your authenticity made those patterns visible on their own. That's the power of a mirror. It doesn't accuse, it reveals. But here's where it becomes uncomfortable for them. Once someone becomes aware of their own patterns, they can no longer operate in complete ignorance. There's a part of them that knows, and that knowing creates tension because now their actions don't fully align with their awareness. They might pull away, but now they're aware that they're pulling away. They might avoid a conversation, but now they recognize what they're avoiding. And that awareness doesn't just disappear when they create distance that follows them. That's why your presence becomes something they can't easily escape, even when you're not physically there. Because you didn't just exist in their external world, you activated something in their internal world. You introduced a level of clarity that lingers. And clarity, once experienced, changes everything. It disrupts the old narratives they've been living by. It challenges the justifications they've used to maintain. Distance. It creates moments of reflection they didn't have before. Even in silence, even in separation, that mirror still exists in their mind. They may try to distract themselves, to return to familiar habits, to convince themselves that nothing has changed. But deep down, something has changed. Because now they've seen a different way of relating, a different way of being. And more importantly, they've seen themselves in a way they hadn't before. That's why your impact goes far beyond the surface of the relationship. You didn't just share moments with them, you shifted their awareness. You brought unconscious patterns into conscious view. And that kind of shift doesn't reverse easily. But with that awareness comes responsibility. Not your responsibility, but theirs. Because once someone sees their patterns, they are faced with a choice. To grow or to retreat. To evolve or to stay the same. And not everyone is ready to choose growth, especially when it requires facing discomfort. Spent years avoiding. So they may distance themselves from you, thinking that distance will remove the discomfort. But what they're really trying to distance themselves from is the reflection you brought into their life. And that's the part they can't fully escape. Because you showed them something real. Not just about love, but about themselves. True love doesn't operate on a short timeline. It doesn't depend on constant proximity, immediate validation, or even a perfect outcome to have. Meaning, when it's real, it leaves something behind, something subtle but powerful that continues to exist long after the situation itself has changed. It plants seeds in places that may not even be visible at first, especially in someone who isn't ready to fully receive it in the moment. When you loved them, you weren't just creating temporary feelings or fleeting experiences. You were introducing something new into their emotional world. A different standard, a different energy, a different way of connecting that didn't rely on fear, control, or avoidance. And even if they couldn't meet you in that space fully, a part of them recognized it. That recognition is where the seed is planted. At the time, they may not have known what to do with it. They may have pulled away, shut down, or convinced themselves that it was too much, too unfamiliar, too uncomfortable. But seeds don't require immediate action to exist. They don't demand instant transformation. They settle quietly beneath the surface, waiting for the right conditions to grow. And life has a way of creating those conditions. As time passes, they encounter other situations, other people, other versions of connection. And consciously or unconsciously, they begin to compare. Not in a way that is always obvious, but in a way that shapes how they feel. They notice when something lacks depth. They notice when something feels inconsistent or surface level. They notice when connection feels forced rather than natural. And in those moments, the memory of what you gave them begins to resurface, not always as a clear thought, but as a feeling, a sense that they've experienced something more genuine before, something more stable, something that didn't require them to perform or protect themselves in the same way. That feeling becomes a reference point, even if they don't fully understand it. That's how the seed begins to grow. Growth doesn't always look like immediate change. Sometimes it looks like quiet reflection. Sometimes it shows up as discomfort in situations they once tolerated easily. Sometimes it appears as a question they can't ignore anymore. Why did I pull away from something that felt real? And that question can stay with them. Because once a person has experienced authentic love, even briefly, it changes their baseline. It expands their awareness of what is possible. And even if they try to return to old patterns, those patterns no longer feel the same. There's a subtle awareness that deeper exists, something they've touched but didn't fully embrace. That awareness can take time to fully develop. For some, it takes months. For others, years. It depends on their willingness to face themselves, to reflect, to grow. But the important thing to understand is that the impact of real love is not limited to the moment it's expressed. It continues. It evolves. It works beneath the surface in ways that can't always be measured or seen. And this is where your role becomes clear. You were never meant to control the outcome or dictate their timing. You were meant to introduce something real into their life, something that could eventually guide them, even if indirectly, toward a deeper understanding of themselves and of connection. That doesn't mean they will always come back or that they will suddenly transform in a way you can witness. But it does mean that what you gave was not lost. It became part of their internal world, part of their emotional blueprint. And that kind of imprint doesn't fade easily. It stays with them in quiet moments, in comparisons they don't fully articulate, in realizations that come when they least expect it. It becomes something they carry, whether they acknowledge it or not, a reminder that real love existed in their life and that they were once seen, accepted, and cared for in a way that challenged everything they thought they knew. And when you step back and see the full picture, you begin to understand something most. People never truly grasp your love was never wasted. It wasn't overlooked. It wasn't meaningless, and it certainly wasn't weak. It was powerful enough to reveal, to challenge, to awaken. It touched places in them they didn't even know existed. And even if they couldn't meet you there, that doesn't diminish what you gave. Because love at that level isn't about immediate outcomes, it's about impact. It's about the way it shifts perspectives, the way it plants truth, the way it introduces a new standard that cannot be easily forgotten. And whether they rise to meet that standard today, tomorrow, or years from now, the fact remains you were part of that awakening. But here's the most important truth of all. Your story doesn't end with them. Your capacity to love, to stay grounded, to show up with authenticity, that's your power. And that power was never meant to be confined to someone who isn't ready to receive it. It was meant to expand, to grow, to align you with experiences and people. Who can meet you at that same depth so you don't walk away empty, you walk away evolved, with clarity, with strength, with a deeper understanding of what real love looks like and what it requires. And most importantly, with the awareness that you never have to shrink, chase, or prove your worth to be valued. Because the right connection won't run from your love, it will rise to meet it. And that's where your journey continues. Not in confusion, not in doubt, but in alignment with something greater, something real, something mutual, something that doesn't just challenge you, but chooses you. Thank you for being here, for listening, and for allowing yourself to grow through this message. Take care of yourself, and until next time, goodbye.